Hello everyone, I hope you all doing well and welcome to this video. So in this video I'm going to be talking about the little Albert experiment. So this social experiment, well, it's not really a social experiment, but anyway, so for this one I have heard about this one before, but I don't know a great deal about it, so it'd be good to explore it with you guys. But the basic thing that I know is that it does involve a child in this one, and it's more so about classical conditioning, and it is from the 1920s. So yeah, it is a controversial one. So I'll give you a bit of background. So the little Albert experiment by Watson and Rayner tested whether an infant could be classically conditioned to fear a neutral stimuli. By pairing a white rat with a loud noise, they induced fear that later generalised to similar furry objects, demonstrating learned emotional responses but raising major ethical concerns by today's standards. So Watson and Rayner in 1920 conducted the little Albert experiment to answer three questions. The first question being, can an infant be conditioned to fear an animal that appears simultaneously with a loud fear-arousing sound? Number two, would such fear transfer to other animals or inanimate objects? And three, how long would such fears persist? So you've probably all heard of this guy that I'm about to mention, but Ivan Pavlov showed that classical conditioning applied to animals. Did it also apply to humans? In a famous though ethically dubious experiment, John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner showed it did. So just before I carry on, for those that don't know, Ivan Pavlov, he you might have heard of it, you might have not, but basically the general gist of his, just for some background, is he conditions dogs to salivate when he rung a bell. So what he would do, he'd ring a bell, give the dog a treat, ring a bell, give the dog a treat, ring a bell, give the dog a treat, and this made the dogs associate getting a treat every time they heard a bell ring. And his experiment, and in the end, after doing this repeat, I can't remember how long it was now, but I know after a certain amount of time, all you'd have to do is ring the bell and the dogs would start salivating because they was expecting a treat. So that's the Pavlov. And so Watson and Rayner decided to see if it would work in humans with that sort of concept. So conducted at Johns Hopkins University between 1919 and 1920, the experiment aimed to provide experimental evidence for the conditioning of emotional responses in infants. At the outset, Watson and Rayner worked with a healthy, fearless 9-month-old boy they nicknamed Little Albert. His exact identity remains uncertain, with researchers debating whether he was Albert Barger or Douglas Marriott. The researchers obtained permission from Albert's mother to observe and test him, designing a procedure to see if they could condition a fear response to a previously neutral object. So let's see some more about little Albert. So he had been raised from birth in a hospital environment, as his mother worked as a wet nurse at the Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children. At 9 months old, he was healthy, weighing 21 pounds, and was described by Watson and Rayner as stolid and unemotional. This unusually calm temperament, along with his robust health, was one of the main reasons he was chosen as a subject for the study. This very stability may also have shaped how he responded during the conditioning trials, making him less reactive than a more emotionally expressive child might have been. So, let's get started with the baseline session. When Albert was approximately 9 months old, the researchers tested his reactions to various neutral stimuli. He showed no fear of a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, masks with and without hair, cotton wool, or burning papers. Instead, he typically tried to reach out and manipulate the object, curious rather than afraid. The only thing that startled him was the sudden striking of a steel bar behind his head, which caused him to startle and briefly hold his breath. On the second strike, his lips trembled, and on the third, he cried suddenly. This was the first time a laboratory situation had produced fear in him. Observations from his mother and hospital staff confirmed that Albert rarely cried and had never shown fear or rage before. So, conditioning sessions. 2 months later, when Albert was just over 11 months old, Watson and Rayner began the conditioning procedure. Their aim was to see if they could make him fear a white rat by pairing it with the loud noise that had previously startled him. First session, so this was when he was 11 months and 3 days old. When the rat was placed near Albert, he reached for it with interest. Just as his hand touched the animal, the steel bar was struck behind his head. He jumped violently, buried his face in the mattress, but did not cry. On the second pairing, he again reached for the rat, but when the noise sounded, he startled violently and whimpered. The researchers stopped after those 2 trials so as to not upset him too much. So the second session, he was 11 months, 10 days old. A week later, Albert was tested again. At first, when shown the rat alone, he fixated on it, but hesitated to touch. When it brushed his hand, he pulled away sharply. After several more pairings of rat and noise, 5 in total, his reaction escalated. When the rat was presented without any sound, he puckered his face, whimpered, turned away, and eventually began to cry. On one occasion, he crawled away so rapidly he nearly fell from the table. Between trials, Watson and Rayner gave him his wooden blocks to play with. This was an important control. It showed that this fear was specific to the rat, not a generalised anxiety. With the blocks, Albert played happily, smiling and gurgling, which helped him calm down between the stressful pairings. By the end of the second session, Watson and Rayner concluded that Albert had developed a conditioned emotional reaction. The once neutral rat now triggered fear responses even without the loud noise. Transfer sessions. After Albert's fear of the rat had been established, Watson and Rayner tested whether it would extend to other animals and objects. This was an important question. Could a conditioned fear generalise to stimuli that were similar in appearance or texture? So, let's look at reactions to animals. So, rabbit. Albert leaned away, whimpered, and eventually burst into tears when it touched him. And then a dog. Initially a milder reaction, shrinking back without crying, but when the dog approached his face, Albert turned away, whimpered, and began to cry. Reactions to objects. A fur coat. He withdrew sharply to the side, cried, and tried to crawl away. Cotton wool. He kicked it away and refused to touch it with his hands, though he eventually played with the paper wrapper while avoiding direct contact. Santa Claus mask and human hair. The mask with white hair made him cry and attempt to turn away. Similarly, Watson's own hair and that of 2 observers provoked negative reactions. So let's have a look at some conflicting responses. In some cases, he displayed a conflicting tendency to manipulate the objects, reaching out to touch but quickly withdrawing. At other times, he played more vigorously with his wooden blocks after a frightening trial, almost as if compensating for the fear by slamming them down harder than before. Testing in a new environment. The researchers also tested Albert in a new environment, a large, well-lit lecture hall, instead of the small dark room where previous trials had taken place. In this setting, some of his reactions were weaker. For example, his response to the rabbit and the rat was less intense, but when a previously quiet dog suddenly barked near his face, Albert fell over and cried loudly, startling even the adult observers. So, these tests showed that Albert's conditioned fear could generalise widely to other furry objects, though his reactions varied in strength depending on the stimuli and setting. So, let's have a look at the experimental procedure. So, we have classical conditioning. So, So neutral stimuli. This is a stimuli that, before conditioning, does not naturally bring out the response of interest. In this case, the neutral stimuli was the white laboratory rat. Initially, little Albert had no fear of the rat. He was interested in the rat and wanted to play with it. Unconditioned stimuli. A stimuli that naturally and automatically triggers a response without learning. In the experiment, the unconditioned stimuli was a loud, frightening noise made by striking a steel bar with a hammer behind Albert's head. Unconditioned response. The unlearned natural response to the unconditioned stimuli. In this case, the unconditioned response was Albert's fear response to the loud noise, crying and showing distress. Conditioning process. Watson and Rayner paired the rat with the loud noise. Each time Albert reached for or looked at the rat, the steel bar was struck. After several pairings, Albert began to associate the rat with the frightening noise. Conditioned stimuli. After several pairings, the previously neutral stimuli, the rat, becomes the conditioned stimuli, as it now elicits the fear response even without the presence of the loud noise. And then finally, we've got the conditioned response. The learned reaction to the conditioned stimuli. The conditioned response was Albert's fear of the rat. Even without the loud noise, he became upset and showed signs of fear whenever he saw the rat. So, 1 month follow-up. 31 days later, Albert's fear responses were retested. Some were weaker than before, showing signs of partial extinction, but clear avoidance remained. It also revealed how children may use coping mechanisms like thumb sucking to manage distress. Persistence of fear. When shown the rat and rabbit, Albert no longer reached with immediate intense crying, but he still withdrew his body, turning his head away and avoided direct contact. His reaction suggested that the conditioned fear had diminished in intensity but not disappeared, and there were some new behaviours. During his follow-up, Albert displayed several new fear-related behaviours: head nodding, a repetitive motion when distressed. He started shuddering, a physical tremor-like response, and lastly, he started to cover his face, using his hands to shield himself from the rat and the rabbit. When presented with the rabbit, Albert alternated between curiosity and avoidance. At times he reached out tentatively to touch it, but then quickly withdrew in distress. On one occasion, he vocalised "Dada" while leaning away, reflecting a mix of social engagement and fear. Thumb sucking as a coping strategy. Albert sometimes sucked his thumb during testing. This behaviour seemed to block or soothe his fear response, making him appear calm. Watson and Rayner had to physically remove his thumb from his mouth in order to elicit the conditioned reactions again. Extinction and generalisation of fear. In this experiment, a baby who had previously shown no fear of a white rat was conditioned to become afraid of it. The study also illustrated two important concepts from Pavlov's work on classical conditioning. Extinction occurs when a conditioned association gradually weakens and eventually disappears if not reinforced. Although the conditioned fear response can be strong at first, repeated exposure to the conditioned stimuli without the unconditioned stimuli will cause the reaction to fade. Generalization happens when a conditioned response transfers to stimuli similar to the original one. For Albert, fear beyond the rat to other furry objects such as a rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, cotton wool, and even a Santa Claus mask. Even after a month, Albert still avoided the rat and rabbit, though his reactions were less intense. This showed the extinction was underway but incomplete. Importantly, Watson and Rayner noted that the conditioned fear could be quickly renewed by repeating the original rat and noise pairing, suggesting that once learned, emotional associations can be difficult to fully erase. Planned deconditioning. The study ended suddenly when Albert's mother withdrew him from the hospital on the same day as the last test. As a result, Watson and Rayner were unable to carry out their planned deconditioning procedures to remove the learnt fear. leaving Albert's emotional state unresolved. So there's a few different ways that they was going to try and decondition Albert. So the first one was repeated exposure to the feared stimuli such as the rat without the noise until the fear response gradually diminished. This is similar to what modern psychologists call exposure therapy. And then another way was pairing the feared object with pleasant tactile stimulation. By today's standards, this method seems ethically troubling, but at the time Watson believed it could create competing positive associations to counteract the fears. Feeding the association. Presenting the feared object while giving Albert food with the aim of creating a positive emotional link between the two. This approach reflects the principle that strong biological drives such as hunger can override fear responsive. And then the last way was constructive play, encouraging Albert to manipulate or play with the feared object, possibly by modelling the behaviour and prompting him to imitate. The idea was that positive interaction could gradually reduce avoidance. So now let's look at some critical evaluations. So the study did not control for pseudo conditioning, meaning the results might not reflect true classical conditioning. Pseudo conditioning occurs when a subject becomes generally more fearful or reactive to stimuli simply because of repeated exposure to a startling event rather than forming a specific association between two stimuli. In Albert's case, repeated exposure to the loud noise could have made him more wary of any new object, regardless of whether it had been paired with the noise or not. This weakens the claim that the white rabbit specifically caused the fear response. If Albert's reactions were due to general sensitization, the experiment would not be strong evidence for the conditioning of phobias in humans. The study failed to control for when Albert was maturing, making it unclear whether age-related changes influenced Albert's reactions. Albert was 11 months old at the start of conditioning and 12 months by the final test. Developmental psychology shows that food responses can naturally emerge as infants grow and become more aware of their surroundings. Without a control group or baseline over time, it's impossible to rule out that his increased fearfulness was a normal part of development. So if Albert, like maturing, contributed towards his behaviour, the results cannot be attributed solely to the conditioning procedure, reducing the studies, so it kind of brings into question the results basically. So we've got Albert's results were inconsistent and a conditioned fear appeared weak in later sessions. The historical record and film analysts show that Albert sometimes interacted with the rat without clear distress and reacted only mildly to other furry stimuli. These inconsistencies suggest that the conditioning was not robust or long-lasting. Weak and variable responses limit the study's usefulness in demonstrating how strong or persistent conditioned fears can be, making the findings less applicable to real-world phobias. The experimental design compounded conditioning and generalisation. Watson and Rayner used the same stimuli for conditioning and for testing generalisation. For example, the rabbit and dog were both conditioned with noise and later tested as generalised stimuli. This means it's unclear whether fear responses to these animals were due to generalisation from the rat or direct conditioning. This reduces the clarity of the results, making it harder to draw firm conclusions about the mechanisms of generalisations in humans. And other methodological criticisms include: was it really a phobia? Some psychologists question whether Albert ever developed a genuine phobia. His fear responses were inconsistent and often weak. For example, when allowed to suck his thumb, Albert showed no fear at all, even during conditioning. His thumb sucking appeared to block his distress, and Watson had to physically remove his thumb more than 30 times before a fear response could be observed. Lack of control and measurement. The study did not include a control subject for comparison, making it impossible to rule out alternative explanations for Albert's reactions. In addition, the researchers did not objectively measure his fear. They relied on descriptive notes rather than clear operational definitions of behaviour, which weakens the reliability of the findings. And then lastly, we got problems of generalisation. The experiment was conducted on a single infant, which means the results cannot be generalised to other children. Albert was also unusual. He had been reared in a hospital environment since birth and was described by his staff as never showing fear or rage. His temperament may have made him a poor representative of typical infant development. So, let's look at some of the ethical issues. So, the Little Albert experiment was conducted in 1920 before ethical guidelines were established for human experiments in psychology. When judged by today's standards, the study has several concerning ethical issues. So the first one is lack of informed consent. Albert's mother was not fully informed about the true aims of the study. She did not know that her child would be deliberately frightened. The absence of transparency violated the principle of respectful persons and denied her the opportunity to make an informed decision. Try that again, get my teeth in. So we got deliberate psychological harm. Watson and Rayner intentionally induced fear in an infant. From the perspective of do no harm, this was highly unethical. The distress Albert displayed, crying withdrawal and an attempt to escape, shows that the procedure caused clear emotional suffering. Failure to decondition. The researchers ended the study without attempting to reverse the condition fear. While failing to provide deconditioning, they neglected the principle of the duty to minimise harm and maximise well-being. Albert was left in a fearful state with no effort to restore his emotional balance. And then lastly, we've got possible long-term effects. Because Albert was withdrawn from the hospital after the final test, no follow-up was ever conducted. This raises a troubling possibility that he carried dangerous fears into later development. Watson's decision not to track Albert's well-being illustrates a disregard for responsibility to participants. So that is the conditioning of little Albert. So with this one, I do see how it's controversial. I mean, obviously using a toddler, well, a baby, like it's not fair, especially when you're trying to learn, a child, basically a little human, to be scared. I mean, that is not. It's not nice, especially when his mom wasn't informed. I mean, I know that this was back in the 20s, but even so, I can see why this one's a bit of a controversial one, because there is a no-go. I mean, and especially because there was no follow-up. I mean, hopefully, because he was so young, hopefully he didn't carry on these fears. If he did do fears, because it kind of stopped abruptly, and like some of it said, there's no other subjects. Well, I hate saying subjects, but there's no other children. I mean, I don't personally believe they should use children. I understand why, in a sense, because you kind of learn these fears as you're growing up, but it's still quite from an ethical point of view, I don't agree. From an ethics point of view, it's an interesting one to see if fears can be learned, but I don't like the way they went about it, especially because they didn't. I don't feel like they did enough to support after. I think they should have spoken to his mom a bit more and see if they could keep in contact, like, okay, we'll stop the experiments, but there is a chance that your child is now scared of like a Santa mask. Like, you know, I just hope that they're okay, you know, or that they was okay when they got older. I haven't found anything about what happened after, because like it said, they didn't follow up after they stopped the experiment, so I'm not sure if later in life, if the, you know, if you're still scared of the rats or anything. But yeah, but that is the general gist of the little Albert experiment. So if you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe, it really helps me out. And if you have any suggestions for anything else you'd like me to cover on this channel, anything at all, let me know either in the comments below, over on X, Instagram, or in my email, or my links with my YouTube bio. And I'll see you all in the next one.